Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Miller, president of the Texas Nationalist Movement, and I want to thank you so much for being a part of this webinar and live stream tonight. We have a very special guest, and if you have perused our video library, you will see that this is yet another in a long series of webinars that we're doing to both inform, enlighten, and engage you on the issues surrounding TEXIT. So if you're joining us tonight, we really do appreciate you being here with us, and definitely want to encourage you to send in your questions for our guest tonight. If you'll look at the bottom of your screen and look at the crawler, you can see there are many ways that you can engage with the TNM. But also, if you would like to send in your questions, I would encourage you to post them in the chat on the YouTube channels, as comments on the Facebook pages, or I do believe that we're taking questions via LinkedIn where we are live streaming tonight. So, however you can get them to us. But additionally, you can email them, send them over to webinar@thetnm.org. That's webinar@thetnm.org. And if you can't remember that, it'll be scrolling at the bottom of your screen for the duration of this. All right. Look, it's time to get this one started. We are very excited to have our guest tonight. And I want to go ahead and get him introduced so we can really start diving off into the meat of everything. Tonight, as our special guest, we have Dr. Matt Qvortrup. He's professor of political science at Coventry University in the UK and professor of constitutional law at the Australian National University. He's a lawyer, a political scientist, and a prolific author, having written 15 books on referendums and democracy. He's also advised 16 independence movements around the world, something we're going to be talking a lot about tonight. His latest book, I Want to Break Free, A Practical Guide to Making a New Country, provides a step-by-step guide to forming an independent country, from organizing a referendum and winning it to receiving official international recognition, establishing a currency, and much, much more. And so without further ado, I'd like to bring on Dr. or Professor, as his title says, Matt Qvortrup. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Daniel. It's wonderful to be here, and it's a great honor.
Well, look, let's start by telling everyone where you're at right now, because
well,
obviously the sun's shining.
The sun is shining. Yes, it's actually not as warm as it ought to be. I am in the Australian capital, Canberra. So it's of course summer down here, and I am at the moment. I'm sitting in my office at the Australian National University, where I'm teaching constitutional and indeed international law. I'm sitting down here partly because I'm an academic and that's what I do, but also because I'm involved in a number of issues pertaining to independence in the Southern Hemisphere. Now, people can be forgiven for not knowing what Bougainville is or where Bougainville is. Bougainville is part of Papua New Guinea. They voted in a referendum on the rules that were partly inspired by what I wrote in one of my earlier books, and I've been involved in a practical sense with the Bougainvillean government. They voted over 90% for independence, and now we're into the difficult bit after the referendum of actually creating a new state. Obviously, they've had the endorsement. They now need to get all the practical things in place so that they can actually start life on their own. And maybe I can sort of segue into that. And I know people in Texas don't mind a bit of free enterprise. So as Daniel said, I've written a book, I Want to Break Free. Here it is. The book, as you might seen from the title, if you're music lovers, is a reference to a man called Freddie Mercury, who was quite famous in the country where I come from. And Freddie Mercury was a fairly flamboyant performer. Each of the chapters in my book, by the way, have a sort of a rock reference. But the overall thing, if you want to create a new country, is that you really need to be a bit of a Freddie Mercury type of performer. You need to be somebody who can get the crowd to sing along with you. You need to be somebody who is unapologetic and who has the confidence to stand up. Now, in in all things to do with creating a new country, there are different stages and different steps you have to take, and in many ways there is no case fits all. But there are a number of common denominators for things that you need to do. So first of all, you need to start a movement. You need to create that sense of momentum, this sense of destiny, historical destiny, that is really the all important thing for a country to start its journey towards independence. And I'll come back to that in a second. Then after that, you need to get the domestic politics in order. You need to find a way of holding a referendum for independence. You then, after that, again, you need to get the international recognition for your state, which is something that people often get misunderstand a little bit. And then after that, you need to make sure that you have friends in the great world, so that they can support your achievements and your achievements at home, so you can become an international state. And then you have to start making money. And Daniel, by the way, do interrupt me. I talk too much. That's my job.
That's okay. I do a live stream every Wednesday night called Coffee Talk, and it's more talk than coffee most of the time. So, but look, you're talking about sort of the practical steps you line out in the book, but I think let's back up a little bit. I touched on it a little bit in the intro where we talked about you've worked with 16 different independence movements around the world. How about just running down a list of some of those and maybe some of the highlights?
Well, some of the, yes, certainly, yes. I mean, I already mentioned Bougainville, and that's what I'm currently dealing with. I dealt with Scotland, which of course is in some ways close to my own heart because I am from England, and that notwithstanding, I think that the people in Scotland should be at least allowed to look at their own prospects for independence. I've also looked at the case of South Sudan, where I was working actually for the other country that is close to you, or that you're technically still part of, the United States.
Our neighbor to the north.
Your neighbor to the north, yes, and a great country that is in many ways. And they asked me to be involved in the Sudanese referendum, which was obviously very different from my experiences in Scotland later on. But in many ways, they're the same sort of issues that you have to deal with in those cases. Then, so all my life, really, I should say, I've been interested in this particular aspect. My parents at some stage lived in Canada, and this was in 1980. I'm now showing my age, and I was when other kids would be interested in football or baseball, living in Canada, that's very hard. There's only one team, that's the Blue Jays, and they're not particularly great. So maybe that was the excuse for while I was interested in politics from a very early age. And at that time, Quebec was voting for independence in 1980, and I remember I wrote an essay in my history class, and Mr. Van Plu, my history teacher, rang up my family and was quite concerned that I thought that people who spoke French and who have a very distinct culture that is very different from the rest of Canada could become independent. So it's sort of like maybe that slightly anarchistic streak started there. Then later, as an adult, having studied this issue, I went to England to study and back home, as it were. And then when I started doing my doctorate, I took it in Oxford. I took time out to go to Canada, or to Quebec, I should say, and look at their case when they voted there. So that's been another place I've been involved in. So basically, all over the world, I have looked at these particular cases. I was in Catalonia at the time when, which is where Barcelona is, and it's part of Spain that wants to secede. I was there, and more recently I've been involved with Western Sahara. Now, I should say that my job, you might say I'm a hired gun. That's a pretty Texan thing to be, isn't it? And I could continue that metaphor till the cows come home. That's also pretty Texan. But I should say, basically what I do is I write books about how the process is. This is, for Texas to become independent, or New Hampshire, or California, or Quebec, or Bougainville. That's not my call, really. I just say what the process is like. I write books about it, and it's of course it is for the people to do that. I don't sort of pretend to be parachuting in and tell countries what they should do and not do. But I think one of the things that is really important to say is that, or maybe phrased in a different way. The other day, I had a request from a student who wanted to write a thesis about Western Papua, which is a part of Indonesia. And the student was going to be sponsored by the Indonesian government. And somebody, a bureaucrat from the Indonesian government, then rang me up and said, in an accent that I will not even try to emulate, do you seriously believe that Western Papua could become an independent country? And I said, well, it's not what I, or do you seriously want? I said, well, it's not what I seriously want, because I don't live in Western Papua. But if you're asking me if I seriously believe that Western Papua could become an independent state, then my answer will be yes, because a state, and we're getting into the legal theory now, a state in international law is a place that has a defined territory, a defined population, that has a government and that is independent of other governments. So if you are able to perform the functions of a government, raise taxes, arrest criminals, and so on and so forth, then and you're able to do that of your own stream, then you have a government. And when people are asking these questions about, do you seriously believe this or that part of the world could be an independent country, I normally sort of ask the opposite question. I'll ask the question, do you think Norway should again be governed by Sweden? Do you think that Belgium should be reintegrated with the Netherlands? Do you think that Iceland should then again become part of Denmark? Now, most of these cases, Norway, Belgium, and Iceland, are countries that we probably think have been around for a very long time. They have been around for a long time. The Icelandics had the oldest parliament in the world, but it was a local parliament under Danish rule for about 1,000 years. Icelandic was more a cultural thing than a political thing. But then this culture of the Icelandic became a political culture. There was an element of Icelandic nationalism. And Iceland then, less than 100 years ago, about 70 years ago, became an independent country in its own right. Now, we would have thought that Iceland's been around forever. Most people would probably think that Finland's been around forever. Finland, until 100 years ago, was part of Russia and seceded from that empire, I should say. What is interesting about all of these cases, even the Finnish case, is that all of these independence movements, all these new countries, newly minted countries, were established without fighting. I can just add another example, if I may. Malta, most of you will probably think of as an island in the Mediterranean that's been around for a long time, and I think St. Paul landed there, and there was so even mentioned in the Bible as a place. However, Malta wasn't an independent country. It was part of Britain until 1964. Malta then voted. There was a simple act of the British Parliament to say, let them go. And they did. So countries can work quite well, have worked quite well. And there's no reason in law or indeed in politics or culture why they should not be more of them. We've had a 200 to 300%. We used to, well, it depends on where you draw the line, but in the last 100 years, we have had a quadrupling of the number of independent states in the world. And I think the world is no worse now than it was 70 years ago.
No, I mean, look, it's the same case that we make when we hear someone from New England saying that Texas that Texas doesn't have a right to independence. We say, great, we expect you to pay your taxes to London next year, right? Because obviously it works. Or do you pay your taxes to Mexico City? Obviously, independence happens, and and I think going back to what you said a moment ago, your definition of a state, which is sort of that first thing that you need that you talked about, has some really interesting implications, particularly for the states of the United States. I mean, it's effectively baked into the name. They have, much like Texas, we have our own government, our own taxation policy. We have all of those things. The one thing that we have, unfortunately, is this membership in a federal system that siphons money out of our pockets. And so, really quickly, because I'm seeing some questions come in, while I'm getting ready to ask this question, let me remind everyone, if you'd like to submit a question, drop it in the chat on YouTube. Feel free to drop it in the comments on Facebook or LinkedIn, or email it into webinar@vtnm.org. That said, with these really interesting implications related to the states of the United States, Texas in particular, but obviously many people that are on here from many other places, what should they, since they've not seen this sort of independence here in a very long time, what lessons should independence movements here take from the independence movements around the world over the last 75 to 80 years?
Well, one of the things that let's not just restrict ourselves to the 75 years. I think let's go a little bit further back, because we have a richer history of that. I think the most important thing is to create that sense of momentum. I have in Scotland, for example, the thing that really created a sense of momentum for the Scottish independence movement was a film by an Australian, Mel Gibson's film Braveheart, because it sort of fired up people in a way to say, well, actually, Scotland could be an independent country. So I think the really important lesson is to create that sense of togetherness, that sense of we're in this together, that we are part of a movement, and also not to shy away from the passions that you have. A lot of people tend to be very rational about politics, and of course it's sensible to be a rational individual. But there's a Scottish philosopher, sorry if I'm getting stuck in the Scottish groove there, but there's a Scottish philosopher who says reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. So you need to discover the passions, and the best way to discover your passions is to dig into that rich cultural heritage that you have. You don't need to start by sort of talking about tax codes and such matters. The reason why you want to be an independent, or some countries want to be independent, is because they want to thrive, they want to flourish, they want to be what they really are. And what they really are is is that sort of deep sense of things. So if you think about Italy, for example, then Italy, you would think about Italian opera, Italian food, and all of those things. And some of you, if you're sort of highbrow, high-minded people, might go to the opera, and you will know a man called Verdi, V-E-R-D-I, Giuseppe Verdi. I'm sorry if I'm pretending to say it in Italian, Giuseppe Verdi. It sounds much better, doesn't it? And Verdi wrote several operas, and for us, it's sort of very high culture and areas and so on. But for Verdi himself was a great Italian nationalist. Italy did not exist about 150 years ago. And he was instrumental in getting that country together by tapping into all their myths, all their stories, all their shared history, all the battles that they'd lost, and put them to music so people could sing along with them. And it's interesting when you're looking at the history of the cultural history, the musical history of the 19th century. Most of the music that was created then were created by people who believed in their own nations. In Finland, there was a man called Sibelius who wrote a great piece called Finlandia about Finnish independence. We had the same in Italy. Sorry if I'm sort of going off on a tangent and talking about classical music, but it's those sort of passions that you need to tap into. So I will start crowdfunding. I think somebody should start crowdfunding about a movie about Texas, the Braveheart moment. That's one of the things you can take into it. The other thing, and now I'm sort of shifting tact a little bit, is that in an independence movement, you need to campaign in poetry and govern in prose. And I think that line has been used in political campaigning and consulting before. So what you need to do is that you need to have that sort of poetical element to fire people up. But you also need to prepare for the day when you are independent. And one of the things that all independence movements have done, whether they have declared independence or they have withdrawn from union, that's a little distinction I can go into in a second. Norway, for example, withdrew from a union with Sweden, but that's sort of like the smaller technical point. But what was true for all of those independence movements was that they were willing to play hardball. Yes, they did not get into a fight, but they probably didn't get into a fight because they were proud and they were standing up to people and they were saying, to coin the phrase that you've used before, Daniel, to draw a line in the sand and really say, and there will be no crossing this particular line, and stand your ground. Currently, I'm dealing with Bougainville, and in Bougainville, 97% of the people on about over 70% turnout voted for independence. The Papua New Guinean government says, well, we'll deal with this and it will be a slow process. And the Bougainvillean government said, no, it's going to be in 2 years' time. And that's it.
Yeah.
And then you start at that moment, start finding friends around the world. What happened when Iceland became independent from Denmark was that the Danish government in Copenhagen said, oh, but we will have to decide that after the Second World War. We will have to wait a little while. And the Icelandics, instead of waiting for the Danes, contacted the Americans. They offered the Americans to get an air base in the North Atlantic, which was very useful for the Americans because then they could survey the whole region with. And the Icelandics said, we already got a deal with the Americans, and we can have an amicable divorce, or we can have a non-amicable divorce. Faced with that, the Danish government accepted it, and they actually had a pretty amicable divorce. Dentists are still being educated in Copenhagen. They don't have a dentistry, or they didn't until recently have a dentistry school there. So I'm not going to go into dentistry matters, but an amicable divorce is perfectly possible.
Well, and it's interesting that you talk about that particular part of it, because there is I think this sense, perhaps from those that are opposed to even having the discussion about TEXIT. I believe that there is this sense, of course, something you have heard quite a bit, Project Fear during the Scottish independence referendum, during the Brexit debates, this sort of fear mongering that that all of the world is essentially going to collapse in if a state withdraws, or if you get your independence. And I think it's interesting in that what you just talked about was I think almost dovetails into that perfectly. When you talk about playing hardball, I mean, obviously, I think my understanding from what you're saying is that you have to get a really good grasp of the political reality of how to achieve independence, and once you have it, how to keep it. Am I reading too much into it, or is that pretty much where you're at?
You're an avid reader and a very close reader of my argument, Daniel. I know that, and you read it perfectly well. If you're one of my students, I would give you an A for that reading. So you're totally right. It is that, and you need to have a sense of realism about it. People who survive in tricky situations are not the people who think, oh, everything will be fine and jolly good in the end. The ones who survive are the ones who actually are aware of the tricky situations, or are willing to go out and battle there. In the real world. And what you need to know above all is that you need to be realistic about the world such as it is. In one of my chapters in the book, which is called "What's Law Got to Do with It?" That's the Tina Turner reference in that particular aspect of it, and law has got a lot to do with it. We talked about when a state is an independent state, in accordance with international law, and it's not just about being recognized. There's sort of two. Now I'm sort of going into the law professor aspect of this talk, but there's sort of two theories. There's a thing called the constituent theory of of independence, and then there is a thing called the declaratory theory of independence. And a lot of governments in the world think that you have to be recognized to be an independent state. That's what the Chinese think, and the Russian think, and they're going around the world to get some of their little puppet states to recognize. The Russians have occupied a number of areas which of course are not states by international law, and getting them recognized will not make them states. What will make a state, that's the sort of the constituent theory. It's not about how many countries recognize you. Well, that helps and that it looks good. But what is really, really important is that you perform the actions of a state. A state is a fact, it's not a declaration. A state is whether you're able to do all of these things. And in order to be able to do these things that states do, well, you sometimes need friends in high places. One of the reasons why I probably would not have given the Quebec government high marks was that they did not really acknowledge that particular fact. They sort of sent feelers out, this was in 1995, to the American government and said, well, you will recognize this, won't you? And Bill Clinton, who was the president at the time, was sort of rather dismissive of that. And even the French government, speaking French and all of that, were a little bit sort of reluctant, because they were saying, well, what's in it for us? Why should we recognize you guys? And I think the important thing in all things political is to have that sense of empathy with other governments. I think it was Sigmund Freud's daughter once said that empathy is the ability to step into somebody else's shoes and then step out again. And you have to, when you seek recognition and support, more importantly, from other countries, you need to step into those other countries' shoes and then step out again. You have to think, what is it like to be a Macron? What is it like to be a Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of my country? What is it like to be somebody, say, Justin Trudeau or whoever would want to sort of do business with your country? You need to sort of figure out what's in it for them. Norway, which is one of my favorite examples, my surname is Norwegian, so it comes with the territory, I suppose. And the Norwegian government, when they became independent of Sweden, the first thing they did, they wanted actually to establish the Republic of Norway. They then knew that they were not going to become an independent state unless they had the support of Britain. And Britain said, well, we don't really want republics around because we're a constitutional monarchy. Could you do something about that? And the Norwegians, rather than saying, well, we have voted, it's our country and so on, were pragmatic and said, let's see what can we do. They contacted the Danes. The Danes had a spare prince who was basically doing nothing at all. And this prince then was offered to become king of Norway. Suddenly Norway had a king, and the British said, that's fine. Okay, we'll support you. If you need an extra gunboat, here it is. And it's that element of pragmatism that the Norwegians, there was a guy called Christian Michelsen, who was the Prime Minister of Norway at the time. And he was known as, Norwegians have a word for it, which is called teft. And teft is this ability to sort of maneuver, to surf on the zeitgeist, to be sort of willing to do things, to be a bit flexible, but also to stand your ground. And I think in order to become an independent country, you need to have somebody who's got that sort of teft, as the Norwegians call it, that ability to roll with the punches, but also know how to punch back at times.
Well, excellent. Well, Doc, I could sit here and speak with you all day, but you and I will have plenty of time offline to do that. There are a lot of people with a lot of questions. So let's
80, I think, yes.
Oh, there's more than that right now, via email and everywhere else. So this is going to be fun.
81,
so
yeah.
We'll try to get to as many as possible. If we are not able to get to your question, and I will say this, if it is a TEXIT specific question that we have already answered on the website, I would just encourage folks to head over to texitnow.org to get those answers, or time permitting, we'll throw them up there and let Dr. Qvortrup take a look at it and let him spitball it. But let's do this. Let's get to some of the questions.
Yes, and I'm just writing in my Twitter here. If anybody wants to, they can follow me on Twitter and ask me a question. I'm just
Yeah,
going to do.
indeed. We've got. I'll flash.
Or better still, they can buy my book where it's all answered.
There you go.
Yeah, sorry to be capitalist.
There we go. Look at that. And I've got your Twitter handle right up there on the screen. So everyone, go give the good doctor a follow, and give me a follow while you're at it. Look, we've got to get out there, make sure we spread the word that, contrary to mainstream media's assertions, there are serious academics out there that have a CV that is far better than some of these third-rate adjunct professors from Bug Tussle Community College that can comment on this issue. So here we go. Let's get to some questions.
Well, far be it from me, by the way, to poo-poo Farb Community College. I'm sure they're nice people there too. But
you'll understand at some point that is a sort of an inside joke for TEXIT supporters, because the media is very fond of dragging out the same 2 or 3 desiccated husks of professors who don't really know anything about this issue at all to answer all questions about it. So, but anyway, all right, let's take this question from YouTube. Soapstream says, in your estimation, does the U.S. Constitution change your calculus any? And so I'm guessing this is probably about the constitutionality of the issue.
Right, yes. And this is where I will sound a bit like a law professor. Now, some of you will know that there is a case called Texas v. White. In England, by the way, we say and, so we're slightly different there. But so Texas and White, I will call it. So there was a case. It was to do with bonds and so on. It's actually not to do with independence. Back in 1868. And Chase, who was the Chief Justice at the time, was penning this famous judgment there. Now, when I read that particular judgment by the U.S. Supreme Court, I was slightly puzzled, because he talks about there being a permanent, perfect union of states, and then in his judgment, the learned judge goes on to refer to the Articles of Confederation as the basis upon which he makes his decision. Now, in very simple constitutional terms, and I'm sorry if I'm sounding like a constitutional lawyer, which is what I am, but nevertheless, if you are a lawyer, then you base your legal reasoning on the existing legal framework, on the existing constitution. Now, as you all know, the American Constitution was drawn up in Philadelphia in 1787, and that is the only thing upon which you can base your judgment. The Articles of Confederation are null and void. They just basically been superseded by another constitutional order. So there was a constitutional break at that time. So therefore, if in reading that particular case, and indeed also some of the subsequent cases where they refer to that, just basically is not good law. If Chief Justice Chase was one of my students, he wouldn't do quite as well as Daniel Miller in my class, and he would probably get a D for that particular assignment, because there is some other extenuating circumstance, he does cite other cases. But it's just really not a great case. Now, the other aspect, and I should preface this by saying that I'm not from Texas. I am a lawyer and a political scientist in addition to that. So one of the things I should say is that also constitutional laws, constitutional positions can change. I don't want to sort of go into the hot topics of American jurisprudence at the moment, but Roe versus Wade is a well-known case of a law where the U.S. Supreme Court decided that actually what that was long considered to be the supreme law of the land was actually not. So even if, for the sake of the argument, could argue that the White case was the constitutional position in the United States, that can change. So that could be nullified if you have a court that is that considers the law more important than political expediency. But the particular law that that says that it would be unconstitutional for Texas to secede, in my best estimation, is poorly written and does not stand up to scrutiny. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that I have taken the US Constitution into account, and I wouldn't think it stands up. But maybe I should just say, just in general terms, when do you have a legal right? It's chapter 2 in my book, by the way, which is available online on Amazon and in every good bookshop near you. There are 3 ways in which you can become independent traditionally. If you are a former colony, then you have, by the UN Charter, a right to independence. If you are living in an area where you are oppressed and undemocratic state, Kurdistan, for example, being one of those, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had a right to secede from the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was not a democratic state, or if there is a constitutional provision for that. And in a number of countries also, they have constitutional provisions themselves for seceding. So there are any number of legal avenues that countries can follow when they seek to become independent by judicial route.
Right. For example, here in Texas, we have Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Constitution, which is a reserved right to alter, reform, or abolish. So,
And I think maybe I should just say just a few things about this. I think in our conversation, Daniel, we've talked about whether you declare independence or whether you withdraw from a hitherto existing constitutional arrangement. And it may sound like a little bit sort of sophisticated to draw that distinction, but if you are willingly entering into an agreement, then we have the case of Montenegro, which had willingly entered into a union with Serbia and then withdrew from that union. And also the case that I mentioned before of Norway. Norway willingly, well, not really willingly, but had entered into an agreement with Sweden when Sweden was not upholding their side of the bargain, when the king of Sweden vetoed a law passed by the Norwegian parliament, which was not part of the bargain. Then Norway said, basically, you're not following the contractual obligation, therefore we withdraw. So a withdrawal is slightly different from sort of declaring independence from scratch, and it's probably slightly easier to do. So when you have willingly entered into or have entered into a cohabitation, if you like, as Texas has, then you probably have a little bit of a head start vis-a-vis other parts of the world.
Fantastic. All right. This next question is something that I know you get into in the book. We get asked about it a good bit, related to the national or federal debt. Bruce wants to know, the United States has $31 trillion in debt and growing. When Texas becomes independent, would Texans be responsible for any of that debt?
Bruce, good to hear from you. The very short answer is no. I should probably say a few things about this. In international law, there is no obligation for a new state to honor the debt of the previous parent state. When the first time that was a question was when Belgium in 1830 seceded from the Netherlands. The Dutch said, we want part of you to pay part of the debt, and the Belgians just flatly refused that. Now, so the legal position is that you don't have to pay any share of the debt. If you Google my name and the newspaper The Sun, you will see that I got quite a lot of stick for saying that Scotland could become independent and send the bill to the then finance minister of the United Kingdom. Now, you have to have a thick skin to be in my profession, but I'm pretty happy to get into fights when I know that I'm right and I know that I can win. And in this particular case, Scotland could become independent and just walk away from the debt. After Ireland became independent, Ireland was willing to pay the princely sum of £1 to the United Kingdom. Because the argument was that why should they pay the debt that had been accumulated as a result of Britain buying weapons to suppress the Irish. Now, that's one of you, if you want to be sort of political about it. There was an attempt in the early 1980s to draw up an international treaty that forced countries that became independent to pay their share of the debt. That was not ratified by a sufficient number of countries, and therefore has become redundant, is no longer international law. So a country does not have to pay its share of the debt. They can decide willingly to do so. Ukraine refused to pay part of the Soviet debt, and Ukraine started in a pretty precarious position, and then they weren't able to borrow money from international banks, and then started actually paying some of its share of the Soviet debt. I'm saying that because I want you to know that the world out there is not particularly simple. And if you're starting your life as a poor country, it might be quite difficult for you to get, frankly, the banks to lend you the money. However, if you are the 10th largest economy in the world, as I think Texas would probably be, or 11th, that would probably not be one of your problems. So if you are in a good position, and if you are, Bruce, I don't know if you're from Texas or where you're from, but if you are from Texas and you think that is a particular issue, I think you shouldn't be too concerned about that. They also, when Czechoslovakia broke up into Slovakia and the Czech Republic, they decided to pay a sort of a percentage share. So they divvied up the current debt by the number of people living in each of the two countries, and then paid a proportion of that. So there are all sorts of ways in which you can pay your debt. I'll just come back to the very simple point, which is the legal point. Do you have to pay a share of the debt? And frankly, Texas could become independent and send the bill to Mrs. Yellen, I think her name is, isn't she?
I love that answer. Well, okay, so here's a question that we got. This one's from Beverly. She wants to know, it's a two-parter. Let me slice this up because I know we're going to be running tight on time. Beverly says, Dr. Q has argued that referendums provide heavy incentives for politicians to govern in line with what people want. Could he share some examples of how other independence-seeking states have made such referendums politically expedient for politicians to seriously consider? And I can almost guess the example that you're going to cite.
Oh, do you think it's going to be Brexit then?
That's my suspicion.
Yes, no, that is a very good example of that. Now, Brexit, of course, was the British referendum to leave the European Union. I should preface that by saying that Britain's relationship with the European Union was not a state relationship, but it's still it works quite well anyway. So Britain voted in 2016 to leave the European Union. Now, when 15 years ago I was asked to write an op-ed for the Daily Express about the possibility of such a referendum, which I wrote, and I had written a book at the time on the subject, people said, well, that's completely, it's old hat, it's far out. There's never going to be such a referendum. Then there was a movement that basically said that the Conservative Party would lose votes to the UK Independence Party, or UKIP, and then out of fear for losing these votes, the Conservative Party in Britain, which is a little bit like the Republican Party in the United States, said, well, in that case, we will allow a referendum to take place. They didn't expect that such a referendum could be won, but the referendum was won, and a lot of people, a majority of the British voters indeed, had voted for that. And after that, it would be basically become impossible for anybody in the United Kingdom, certainly the major parties, to advocate anything that would undercut the will of the people. So once you've had a referendum, it becomes important for politicians basically to stay in office, to follow them. There was a French politician who once said, there goes the people, I must follow them, I am their leader. And so it sort of turns it upside down, because the leaders there are there to be the servants of the people. The people have spoken, and you need to do what the people are telling you to do. In sort of political science, we have a thing we call principal agent theory. And it's basically the idea that if you're hiring somebody to do your bidding, that person has to do your bidding for you. So if I go to a dentist and the dentist says, and I say, I pay him to pull my teeth out, and he's done that, then he has to do it, basically. If I'm selling my house, I get an estate agent to sell my house for me. And the estate agent said, well, but that house is worth $500,000. And I know that it won't work for me to sell it for $500,000. I'll say to my estate agent, wait a minute, I said this house is for sale, but not for that price. Don't go sell it for that price. The estate agent then wouldn't be able to sell my house because I am the boss. I am in control. I've hired him. The politicians are there to do what the people tell them to do. And in the case of the Brexit case, they did that. Now, politicians, I should use a Texan example here. Politicians are like oil men. Oil men deal in votes and in shares and things like that. And they deal basically, what they want is to make a profit. Politicians are a bit like oil men. They just don't deal in oil, they deal in votes. And for politicians, basically, it is all about what will be beneficial to them. Politicians can be fickle. That we shouldn't poo-poo. That's just part of their profession. But we then have to figure out how we can use that fickleness for our own purposes. So politicians have to know that unless they are following the will of the people, they will have a very short career. Again, it's about this empathy thing, about the ability to step into the shoes of the politician and then step out again. Figure out what make the politicians tick, and then find a plan that is in accordance with that.
In short, you're saying if a politician is a windsock, be the wind.
Yes.
Okay. Look at that. All right, let's get into it. Oh, we're running short on time, but there's so many great questions here. Okay, there's not even man. This is a good one, but I tell you what, let's get to this one because this keeps coming up an awful lot. Given the history of the United States in the 19th century, there are those out there who, particularly in the opposition, or some people that are probably not as strong-willed as Texans, that believe somehow that TEXIT will lead to civil war. And so we've gotten a lot of questions about that. And obviously civil war is not on our game plan. But how would you respond to those people that are essentially saying that civil war is the inevitable conclusion of a TEXIT effort?
I would say that, of course, I try to be fair-minded here. I try to be base my arguments on legal theory, on political science, and on history. And there is a very simple distinction that we all agree with and we can all follow. You don't need to have a PhD to say that there's a difference between democracies and non-democracies. Now, if you're trying to secede in a dictatorial state, if you're say Tibet or part of Russia, the parts of states that have tried to secede from Russia, and they have met with a pretty harsh response. In dictatorships, in countries that are not democratic, you often see civil war when you try to have secession. Now, even that is not inevitable, but you've often seen that. That's when the dictatorship in Indonesia did not let East Timor go, and there was oppression, and that was also the case in South Sudan. Now, those countries are dictatorships. They are places where there is no public opinion, or the public opinion that exists is being suppressed, and the only way to do politics is by force. If we look at the democratic countries, and you look at the past, say, 80 years of countries that have become democratically independent, the ones that, for example, like Iceland, like Malta, and so on, those countries have become independent without a fight, without a struggle, but with some legal wrangling and arguments, and they've been no less hostile than your average divorce case. So when Iceland became independent of Denmark, the Danes were not happy about that. They wanted to, they were halved in size. But it's not that the people in Copenhagen saying that the Viking ships once again, or whatever they had, because they knew that it was in the interest and it was a democratic decision by the Icelandic population to become independent. When Norway became independent of Sweden, it wasn't as if the Swedes just rolled in their tanks and so on. Now, the Swedes weren't happy about it. They also, the country became 40% smaller. And that was bad for the vanity of the Swedish king and so on. But the Swedes knew that democracy had to prevail. So in democracies, we have not had a single example in the past 80 years of a country becoming independent where there was a fight or a civil war. Civil wars are started in places where the governments do not have the strength, do not have the willingness to tolerate the forceless force of the better argument. That's why the places like China, communist China, and the Soviet Union, I was about to say, in all but name, Russia, they fear the better argument. They fear democracy. They fear people who will come up with rational reasons why they should be allowed to govern themselves. Dictatorships are governed by fear and force. Democracies are governed by the forceless force of the better argument. It'll be the forceless force of the better argument that will be the bedrock of the new states that we'll see in the next 20 years.
All
No
right.
fighting.
Okay. Here's another question. We're rapid fire at this point. How much longer do we have you, Doc?
Oh, you have me as long as you like, because I'm
Don't say that. You might the questions are going to light up. We'll be respectful. Here's a question that came in from Jason. Jason wants to know. He says, given what you've seen around the world with referendums to date, where do you think we are here in Texas in comparison to in history to completing our mission, and what current events do you see as the most pivotal in aiding our cause? So I don't know if you can speak to the latter half of that, but the former half, given the timelines you've seen for independence movements around the world, how would you third party judge where we are on the timeline?
Well, I'll try to be very swift and quick on that particular question. I think you should be able to build a momentum and then maybe have a referendum within the next 10 years. That would be an advisory referendum that would say, basically, this is what we want. And then on the basis of that advisory referendum, you'll have a mandate to start negotiating with the US government. It's if you want to read the legal argument, there is a case called Quebec. I'll read right down here. In Canada, where the Canadian Supreme Court set out what they expected to be the timeline and the procedure for such a movement. So I think you should take a leaf out of the Quebec book, start organizing a referendum. That wouldn't technically be, it would be an advisory referendum. It wouldn't have the force of law, but it would be a starting mandate for negotiation. Depending on how strong a mandate you then have, you will then have a better case. But I think the most important thing is that you also let it be known to the outside world that you are a country that has a cultural identity which is distinct from that of the United States. Whenever I've met a Texan, he's never said, I'm an American. He always says, I'm a Texan. And the same is true in Scotland. People from Scotland don't call themselves Brits, they call themselves Scots. But I would say within a 10-year period, you should do that. And again, there is a Gantt chart in my book that answers exactly that question.
And if we compress those timeframes and exceed your expectations, then the better, right?
Yeah, and I think it's important to yes, it is always better. I mean, people are always in a hurry, except law professors in Australia and Britain who seem to be quite relaxed about things. But that was a reference to myself. So I think sometimes it's a long game to become independent. It took about 50 years for the Italians, but then again, the Italians are a little bit more laid back than the Texans when it comes to time pressure.
Right. Okay, let me get to this question. This has actually come in. This come in two different forms. This one is from John in a great place called Rising Star, Texas. But John wants to know, he would like for you to differentiate, if there is a differentiation, between the idea of a state in the United States as opposed to a state in an independent worldview, is what he says. So I guess global perception of the term state versus perhaps what a state is here, if there is any difference at all.
Yes, right. That's a very straight legal question, which I can give a very straight legal answer to. A state is completely free to conduct its own foreign policy. A state is a defined territory, is a defined population, as I said before, and the state is one that is not dependent, does not share its sovereignty with anyone else. Now, a state in a federation like the United States has basically transferred certain powers to the central government. In this case, it's the right to a foreign policy, defense policy, and so on. Those are things that are now basically the reserve or the preserve of Washington. The same is true here in Australia. Health policy is at the national level, education policy at the state level, and so on and so forth. When you become an independent state, you're basically in charge of all of it. Now that comes with that freedom that goes with that. However, it also means that sometimes if you're a smaller country, you might have to follow, you may not have your own currency, or even if you have your own currency, that will be tied to a bigger currency. So it doesn't mean you can do whatever you want to do. It's sort of, freedom with a bit of responsibility. But a state in the sort of the US sense of the word, like a part of a federation, a state which is part of a federation is limited in what it can do, especially in foreign affairs and defense. Scotland cannot have its own embassies elsewhere, for example. They can't have their own army, even if a thing called the Scots Guard, it's still controlled by the UK government. A state as a subject of international law is an entity that does not share sovereignty with anyone else.
Okay, excellent. Well, I tell you what, let's take two more out of this, and then we can, I think, start the wrap up, if that's all right with you. That I think I'm going to take that as a yes.
It is indeed. Aye.
Okay. So let's. There is we have a lot of questions related to really a lot of the mechanics of TEXIT, the process, the policy that comes after it. Let's see if we can't get those all wrapped up into one sort of line of thought from you, from your book, from your experience. What is the I think the position, or perhaps the cost or the perils of obsessing about some of the minutia, right? Some of the, not that it's not important, but that, that there's a lot of it. What is your viewpoint on that? Is it something people need to be looking at now? Or have you seen in your experience that many of these things work themselves out in the way that they're supposed to?
Very few things just work themselves out. It's right. The reason why I wrote my book actually was I had written a report for the Bougainvillean government about independence, and I spoke to my publisher, and I said this would be interesting to just publish as an academic book. And Tom Dark, my publisher at the time, said, "Look, Prof, you've written many books which are just for an academic audience. If you want to write a book, then write a practical book, write a DIY guide to how to set up an independent country,
Right.
Because all of this is not about political philosophy and all of that. And I like to dabble as much in political philosophy and Tocqueville and the Federalist Papers and what have you, as much as the next professor person. However, most people aren't particularly interested in that. Most people are practical DIY sort of do-it-yourself yourself kind of people. They are more interested in the, sort of the Gantt charts than in Greek philosophy. So what my editor said at the time was, provide that sort of details of what you really need to do. This is like going into the negotiations. You take my book with you, and then you have a problem, and you say, okay, how do I write a constitution? What do I do about that?
Mhm.
Now, it is really important that you get those things right. Now, when you go into battle, metaphorically speaking, because there's no need to fight about these things, but when you go into this peaceful battle, you need to be aware of the things that you need to do. Now, it might be boring to talk about how to draw up a constitution, who's going to pay the taxes, but the pros aspect of this is extremely important. You need to decide what kind of currency arrangement you want to have. Do you want to have your own currency with all the pitfalls that goes with that? Do you want to just share the currency that is in circulation near you? Do you want to repay part of the other country's debt? Are you economically strong enough to go it your own? And who are the countries that you need to chum up with in order to have trade back in the day? And it's a bit like setting up a shop. Now, a lot of people want to have a cafe. I know loads of my friends who sort of been a bit tired of being academics, and then they want to have a coffee shop and sell cakes and so on. And they think it's just going to be all hunky-dory, but they also have to fill in tax returns. They need to pay the rent. They need to do all of these sort of things. And it's wonderful to have a dream, and it's wonderful to have a little bit of a hipster cafe, maybe in Austin, Texas, and one of these other wonderful places. But you also, even if you're living in Austin or St. Antonio or wherever you are, you need to also do the sort of mundane types of things.
Right.
And what I try to do in my book is to outline the good, the bad, and the ugly, to take a local reference to independence. And you could sort of say the good, the bad, and the frankly very boring aspects. And the very boring, prosaic things are the things you have to get into. By all means, sing along, have the Texan songs and all of that, but don't forget, you also need to do the slightly tedious bits.
Right. And I get the sense, just as a follow-up before we go to the next one, I get the sense from the way that you laid it out in the book, the way you laid out the chapters, was as much chronological as anything else. And so, I noticed that in the book, in the order, a lot of that, which you refer to as mundane, seemed to come after you get the referendum, after you've got the will of the people. Is that the correct order? Is that the way that people need to be looking at it?
It is indeed, Daniel. Again, sorry, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, vinyl record.
Are you gonna say read the book?
No, in this case, I'm actually not going to say that. I could say that. Thanks for putting that in. I totally agree with you. But what I was saying before is, you start with prose, you start with poetry, and you completed it all in prose. So the first thing you need to get is to get the poetry right. Without getting the poetry right, you're never going to get to the prose. But once you've done the poetry bit, you need to change the whole ship around and then get into your more sort of prosaic mode. So you need to be able to jump from being a poet to being a pragmatist. And you need to be both. You need to be able to fire people up, but you also need to be the attention to detail sort of person who can write a text code. So it's from the that's why it's so tricky in some ways to become an independent country, but it's not impossible. There's another American song called "Breaking Up Is Hard to Do," and I know that's a great tune. I like Neil Sedaka as much as the next person. I doubt that he's Texan though, but breaking up is not necessarily that hard to do, you just have to make sure you follow the steps. And I don't know if a guy called Will Young was ever famous in Texas, but his song was called "I Think I Better Leave Right Now," and maybe that could be your theme song.
There you go. All right, Doc. Well, here we go. Final question before the wrap up. And this is, I think this is an interesting one. As you know, the TNM is, or excuse me, the TNM has draft legislation to give the people of Texas a vote on TEXIT in November of next year. However, the legislators don't seem convinced. Uh, if you were talking to, or you could say one thing about giving the people a vote to Texas elected officials, what would you say?
I think I'll sort of divide it into two. Now, the other thing that I have again said before is that you have to make sure that there's something in it for them. Now, what would make the representative of Houston or Dallas or wherever, Fort Worth, anywhere, what would make that particular individual more susceptible to your argument? And what will make that particular individual more susceptible to your argument is his or her continued career. These people are only interested in one thing, is to get re-elected. They've given up a probably another career to become politicians. And I know that the legislature in Texas doesn't sit all the time, frankly, but these guys like to be politicians. They would like to remain politicians. And therefore, they need to know that their continued um, status as or even being politicians will, in all likelihood, depend on whether they grant you that right. That could be the sort of short answer to that. The other slightly more sort of longer term one is one I think they tried in Alaska, where they have the initiative. Now in Texas, unlike roughly half of the other states in what is currently the United States of America, have the initiative. You don't have the initiative. You don't have this thing that can force politicians to that. And it would have been much easier if you had the initiative and even the constitutional initiative, like you have in for example in Massachusetts or in California or in Arizona. But because you don't have the initiative, there is a slight disadvantage there. I know in Alaska they tried to use the initiative to force a referendum, so that's the thing they could do there. So where you have the initiative as the legislative initiative, that is a good way of using that. I'm saying this sort of more broadly because I know there'll be people here who are watching who are from different states where they have a slightly different framework. But the short answer to the question is create an incentive for the local representative to support this. It's only if you can create an incentive for this person, they should do it. Otherwise, they will say, well, what's in it for me? So if you go and talk to one of these politicians, that politician, if he even gives you the time of day, will say, what's in it for me? And you have to be on the front foot and say, you should do this because otherwise your career will probably be reaching its conclusion in a very near future. And if you want to remain a politician, you should do this. Remember, you are my leader, therefore you have to follow the people.
There you go. Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Constitution. All political power is inherent in the people, but what good is power if you don't use it?
Quite.
So, okay, well, fantastic. Well, Doc, I have to tell you, folks, you're going to want to pick up a copy of Dr. Qvortrup's book, I Want to Break Free, a practical guide for making a new country. I have read it probably 3 times since I got my hands on it. And every time I read it, I find something else. It is a perfect complement to TEXIT, Why and How Texas Will Leave the Union. And so I would encourage you to get both of the, yeah.
I think that's up there somewhere. Your book, Daniel, is there, and my book is up there.
That's perfect. Well, it's an honor, and I really do appreciate it. Doc, tell folks where they can get the book, where they can connect with you on social media, where they can find you.
Yes, you can find me, all of you, and thank you, by the way, for letting me take some of your time. I know that you are busy people. I know that there are many other things that you could do this evening. So I am humbled. I'm honestly humbled that you have taken time to listen to a non-Texan, a non-American who has written the book on this subject. If you are interested in my views on these particular issues, you can follow me on Twitter, which is at Dr. Qvortrup. and I have written that in the chat, so you can spell my name, which is, I know it's impossible. And if you then Manchester University Press is where you can get the book. I might even see if I can get a link here, which I will now post. 1 second, just bear with me.
No worries, and we'll get a link to where you can get the book. It'll be in the description on all the videos everywhere.
Yes, and I'm just going to probably put a link in here, if you don't mind. Sorry that I'm being very this is pretty rude actually for you guys, but Daniel, as a friend of mine, you'll know here's the place where you can get the book in the UK. I think it should be available also on Amazon and all of these sort of places, but we don't want to advertise unless they're paying us, and they're not at the moment. But honestly, guys, it's been, ladies and gentlemen, those of no descriptive gender or whatever, I am really humbly honored to have been able to talk to you. And I can see that there are 37 comments. I hope, and I'm happy if you disagree with me. I think all of this is about finding a democratic way forward to govern our own lives. We are, we're free people. We're free individuals. We can only thrive if we are in an environment where we can flourish. And sometimes you can only flourish if you're part of your own culture. And if I have helped you in an indirect sort of way to make that flourishing happening, then that's great. So thank you again, also, Daniel, for inviting me. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Doctor, thank you very much. Looking forward to many, many conversations in our future. Folks, you know exactly where to find him. Be sure to get a copy of the book. And from all of us here at the T&M, Doctor, thank you very much. All right, friends, that has been our time with Dr. Matt Qvortrup tonight. We really, really appreciate his presence tonight and his participation. And hopefully you were able to mine out some things that were applicable, because really the entire conversation has a thread running through it that lays the foundation for what we're doing here in the T&M and with TEXIT. So what I'd like to do as we wrap up, I'd like to encourage you, if you're not already a member of the Texas Nationals Movement, please join us. Go over and pledge your support, tnm.me/vote. That is tnm.me/vote. Go ahead and pledge your support. And again, reach out whenever you get a chance. Connect with us. If you have questions, head over to texitnow.org. Be sure to pick up a copy, not only of the doctor's book, but pick up a copy of mine, TEXIT, Why and How Texas Will Leave the Union. But if you don't want to spend the money on mine, that's okay, because the 100 most asked questions about TEXIT are answered at texitnow.org. So that's going to be a sign off for tonight. So I will leave you with the words that I leave you with every time we're together. They're not my words, or the words of Sam Houston when he said that Texas will again lift its head and stand among the nations. I believe that time is now. And the question is, will you stand with her? Good night, everyone.